The electronic chime of a card reader denying a transaction operates on a very specific frequency. It cuts through the hushed, sterile hum of a hospital lobby like a dropped glass on a tile floor. I listened to that unforgiving tone ring out 3 times before I took a sip of my coffee. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I stood in the cool shadow of a marble pillar in the VIP concierge lobby at St. Jude's Regional Medical Center. 20 feet away, bathed in the warm glow of the reception desk pendant lights, my older brother Bryce was running out of illusions. He wore a tailored navy suit that strained across his shoulders, leaning hard over the mahogany counter. He snatched a silver credit card from the polite, unblinking billing clerk, swapped it for a black one, and jammed the chip into the terminal. Beep! Declined. Bryce scrubbed a hand over his jaw. His voice leaked the distinct, breathless panic reserved for men who have run out of other people's money. He told the clerk to override the system. He dropped names of local politicians. I remained still, resting my hand against the cool stone, securing a plain manila folder beneath my arm. My name is Raylan Robinson, and I was 28 the night my parents stood in our New Hampshire driveway and told me I was no longer their daughter. I am 38 now. How old are you reading this today? Tell me in the comments. Welcome back to Pan of Vengeance, where we keep company with the quiet women who let the golden children dig their own graves, only to purchase the deed to the cemetery a decade later. If stories about ironclad boundaries, silent moves, and undeniable receipts are your kind of evening, settle in, pour a cup, and hit subscribe. The sweating man at the billing desk had not spoken my name in 10 years. Neither had my parents. To understand how the discarded scapegoat ended up holding the master lease on her father's life-saving care, you have to understand the flawed mathematics my family operated on. You have to rewind the clock 10 years to a suffocatingly humid evening in a Bedford driveway and a $50,000 piece of paper I simply refused to sign. It was the summer of 2016. My parents, Richard and Brenda, were Bedford Country Club elites who financed their image on credit. They drove leased German cars and hosted catered garden parties while rotating balance transfers to keep the lights on. I was the boring practical daughter, working 60-hour weeks at a mid-level medical logistics firm. Bryce, on the other hand, was the handsome, fast-talking visionary running his third failing startup. That humid July evening, the facade cracked. Bryce had a shortfall. He needed cash to cover money that had vanished from his company accounts. They cornered me near my practical used sedan. My mother thrust a stack of loan documents toward my chest. She smiled her tight society smile and said it was a brief bridge loan just to get Bryce over a hurdle. I looked at the paperwork. I am the kind of woman who reads the fine print. Hidden on page 4 was a clause using my parents' house as collateral for the line of credit they expected me to secure in my name. I handed the unfastened pages back to my mother. I told her I would not underwrite fraud. My father stepped forward. He smelled like expensive scotch and desperation. He looked me in the eye with a flat, cold stare that stripped away 28 years of shared history. Bryce has the brains, he said. Family protects family. If you will not do this, you are nothing to us. I did not scream. I did not cry. I looked at the 3 of them standing shoulder to shoulder, a united front of financial ruin. I slid the unsigned contract into a manila folder, placed it on the passenger seat, and drove to Boston. I accepted the discard because I realized it was not a punishment. It was an escape hatch. The anatomy of a family discard rarely begins with shouting. It usually begins with a staged dinner. That Sunday evening in 2016, Brenda had prepared a crown roast. The house in Bedford smelled of rosemary and floor wax. Our dining room was a curated showroom of upper-middle-class success, featuring a mahogany table and crystal stemware. Every item in that room had been purchased on a rotating carousel of credit cards. I sat at the far end of the table, cutting my meat into precise, uniform pieces. I was 28 years old, exhausted from a 60-hour work week at a mid-tier medical supply firm in Manchester. My clothes were sensible. My car was a 5-year-old sedan with fading paint. I was the invisible structural beam of the Robinson family. Across from me sat Bryce. He was 30. He wore a crisp linen shirt unbuttoned perfectly at the collar. Bryce carried the golden aura of a man who believed his own pitch decks. He called himself a serial entrepreneur. In reality, he was a charismatic sinkhole for venture capital. His latest endeavor was an app that promised to revolutionize local food delivery. It produced zero revenue, but justified his endless networking lunches and leased sports car. Throughout dinner, the silence stretched thin. My father, Richard, poured his third glass of scotch before the plates were cleared. The ice clinked against the crystal. That sharp sound signaled a pivot. They were preparing the ground. The trap did not spring until I gathered my purse to leave. I stepped out the front door into the suffocating humidity of a New Hampshire July. The air felt heavy enough to drown in. I walked toward my car parked at the end of the gravel driveway. Before I could unlock the driver's side door, Brenda stepped into the harsh glare of the motion sensor security light. Richard and Bryce flanked her. They moved as a coordinated unit, blocking my exit. Brenda unclasped her designer tote. Her manicured fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers. She held them out to me with a tight, artificial smile. She used the soothing, lilting tone reserved for coaxing a child. She explained that Bryce had encountered a minor cash flow issue, a temporary hurdle. The investors were delayed and the payroll account was overdrawn. They needed $50,000 by Tuesday morning to bridge the gap. I did not reach for the papers right away. I looked at Bryce. He refused to meet my gaze, staring instead at the dark tree line. I asked my mother why they were bringing this to me. I made a modest salary. I lived in a practical apartment. Richard stepped closer. The smell of scotch rolled off his breath. He stated that my credit score was immaculate. I had zero debt. The bank would approve a personal loan in my name within 24 hours. He framed it not as a request, but as a logical deployment of family resources. I was the untapped equity. I finally took the stack of papers. The motion sensor light cast sharp shadows across the pages. I am an operations manager. My entire career is built on identifying liabilities in supply chains. I read contracts for a living. I flipped past the cover sheet. I scanned the interest rates and the repayment terms. Then I reached page 4. My thumb stopped moving. Buried in the third paragraph of the collateral stipulations was a very specific address. It was the address of the Bedford house we were standing in front of. The air in my lungs turned to ice. I read the clause twice to ensure my eyes were not playing tricks in the poor lighting. I understood the financial mechanics immediately. The bank refused to lend Bryce another dime because he was a liability. The bank refused to lend to my parents because their debt-to-income ratio was a disaster. They needed my pristine signature to secure the loan. But a signature alone was not enough for $50,000. The bank required collateral. My parents had secretly offered their home to back my loan. If I signed that paper, I assumed the legal debt. If Bryce failed to pay me back, the bank would come after me. If I could not pay, the bank would foreclose on the Bedford house. The blame would fall entirely on my shoulders. I would be the daughter who lost the family home. It was a perfectly engineered trap. Bryce would walk away with free capital, and I would be left holding a ticking bomb. I closed the contract. The loud rustle of the paper cut through the chirp of the summer cicadas. I looked directly at my mother. I kept my voice flat and clinical. I explained paragraph 3 to her. I detailed exactly what they were asking me to underwrite. I called it what it was: corporate fraud wrapped in a family favor. Bryce finally spoke, his voice pitched up, defensive and shrill. He claimed I was overthinking it. He promised the app would secure Series A funding by October. He tried to laugh it off, calling me a pessimistic bean counter. I turned my gaze to my father. I expected him to act surprised. I expected him to deny knowing about the collateral clause. Instead, Richard straightened his posture. His jaw set into a hard, rigid line. He dropped the affectionate father routine entirely. The mask slipped off, leaving nothing but cold calculation. He pointed a finger at my chest. "Bryce has the brains," he said. The words hit the humid air like stones. Family protects family. If you will not do this, you are nothing to us." The silence that followed was profound. A neighbor dog barked in the distance. The motion light clicked off, plunging us into sudden darkness. I stood in the pitch-black driveway, holding the evidence of my own expendability. My parents did not view me as a daughter. I was a human credit score, a shield meant to absorb the impact of their golden child's inevitable failure. I did not scream. Shouting is the currency of the desperate, and I was no longer desperate for their approval. I shifted my weight. The motion light snapped back on, illuminating their expectant faces. They were waiting for me to fold. They had spent 28 years training me to yield to their demands, to keep the peace. Instead, I opened the passenger door of my sedan. I slid the unsigned contract into a plain manila folder sitting on the seat. I shut the door. I looked at Richard and Brenda one final time. I told them to have a good night. I walked past them and re-entered the house. I did not run. I walked up the stairs to my childhood bedroom. I pulled a canvas duffel bag from the closet. I moved methodically. I packed my vital documents, my remaining clothes, and my laptop. I left the childhood trinkets, the framed photographs, and the gifted jewelry. I stripped my identity down to the essential components required for survival. When I came back downstairs, the three of them were sitting in the living room. They were silent, watching me carry my bag toward the front door. Brenda opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to launch a new angle of guilt, but I did not pause. I walked out the door and let it click shut behind me. I loaded my bag into the trunk. I got into the driver's seat and started the engine. I pulled out of the gravel driveway without looking in the rearview mirror. I merged onto the interstate, heading south toward Boston. The manila folder rested on the passenger seat next to me. I drove into the night. I did not shed a single tear. The discard did not break me because I finally recognized it for what it truly was. It was an eviction notice from a burning building. They thought they were punishing me by cutting the cord. They had no idea they had just handed me an escape hatch. I was free. But freedom in the wake of a family rupture never remains quiet for long. The panic of a failing golden boy requires a scapegoat, and by the time the sun rose over Boston, my mother had already begun typing the narrative that would set our next conflict in motion. The morning after a family fracture does not offer any cinematic weather to match your internal state. I woke up to a cloudless, bright Tuesday in a budget motel room just off the interstate near the Boston city limits. The air conditioning unit rattled beneath the window, smelling faintly of stale dust and cheap pine cleaner. I lay on the rigid mattress, staring at the water stains on the ceiling. I felt a strange, hollow ache in my chest, but I also recognized an unfamiliar lightness. I had survived the night. I was no longer the designated shock absorber for the Robinson family. My relief, however, was remarkably short-lived. The minor conflict of my departure had already mutated into a public spectacle. On the nightstand, my cell phone began to vibrate. It did not buzz once or twice. The device danced across the faux wood laminate in a relentless mechanical rhythm. I sat up and reached for the device. The lock screen illuminated, displaying 47 unread messages and 14 missed calls. The notifications were not inquiries about my safety. They were a coordinated digital assault. Brenda had not wasted a single hour. She knew the Bedford rumor mill operated with ruthless efficiency. She also knew that if the country club set discovered Bryce was facing insolvency, her social currency would evaporate. My mother treated gossip like a chess match, and she understood the power of a preemptive strike. She needed a scapegoat to explain my sudden absence and cover her golden boy's financial decay. I unlocked a screen and opened the social media application. Sitting at the very top of my feed was a lengthy, carefully crafted manifesto posted by my mother. It was a masterpiece of suburban manipulation. Brenda did not mention the $50,000 loan. She omitted the part where they attempted to leverage their own home to fund my brother's fraudulent application. Instead, she painted a tragic portrait of aging parents betrayed by a heartless child. She wrote about the agony of raising a daughter who would turn her back on her own flesh and blood during a mysterious dark hour. She used words like grief and sacrifice. She tagged her location at the local country club, checking in for a charity brunch, while simultaneously claiming her heart was shattered into 1,000 pieces. The comment section beneath her post was a synchronized chorus of misplaced sympathy. Women I had known since childhood typed out their prayers and offered to bring casseroles. Wives of local politicians applauded my parents for their strength. The community rallied around the victims while casting me as the resident villain. Brenda had successfully transformed my quiet exit into her personal tragedy. I swiped away from the application and opened my text messages. The flying monkeys had been dispatched. Aunt Lorraine sent a blistering paragraph calling me venomous and ungrateful. She claimed my father was experiencing chest pains because of my selfishness. Cousin Greg, a man who had borrowed rent money from me 3 times, sent a sarcastic message thanking me for breaking the family apart. Former high school classmates who had not spoken to me in a decade forwarded screenshots of my mother's post demanding an explanation. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the edges of the phone. My heart hammered against my ribs, drumming a frantic rhythm. The injustice burned the back of my throat. My immediate instinct was to fight back. I wanted to defend my reputation. I wanted to type out a point-by-point rebuttal. I had taken a clear photograph of the loan document before sliding it into my bag. I could upload the image of paragraph 3. I could expose the collateral clause. I could prove Bryce was a financial parasite, draining our parents dry. I could humiliate them in front of their entire social circle. I hovered my thumb over the keyboard. I took a deep breath, inhaling the stale motel air. I forced my analytical mind to override my wounded pride. I am a woman who builds supply chains. I specialize in identifying long-term strategies and eliminating short-term emotional reactions. I remembered a fundamental rule of corporate warfare. You never interrupt an opponent when they are busy making a grave error. Arguing with a smear campaign does not extinguish the fire. It merely provides the flames with more oxygen. If I retaliated online, I would become entangled in a messy public feud. I would look defensive. I would give Brenda exactly what she wanted, which was a continuous, dramatic narrative to distract a town from my brother's impending bankruptcy. Silence starves a rumor. I placed the phone face down on the mattress. I looked across the small room at the canvas duffel bag sitting on the faded carpet. Resting on top of my folded clothes was the plain manila folder containing the unsigned contract. That folder represented the fundamental difference between my brother and me. Bryce built his entire existence on loud, shiny plastic. He relied on platinum credit cards with high limits and exorbitant interest rates to project a mirage of wealth. He needed an audience to validate his worth. He drove leased luxury vehicles and paid for expensive dinners to convince strangers he was important. His power was entirely external and incredibly fragile. I walked over to the bag and picked up the folder. The thick paper felt substantial and rough beneath my fingertips. My power was silent. I did not need an audience. I held undeniable receipts. I possessed the patience to let a ledger balance itself over time. Paper does not need to shout to prove its validity. Facts do not expire just because people choose to look the other way. I made a choice in that cheap motel room that altered the trajectory of my entire life. I decided to let them have the narrative. They could keep the sympathy, the casseroles, and the country club prestige. I would take my freedom. I picked up my phone one last time. I powered the device down. I gathered my belongings and drove to a cellular retail store in downtown Boston. I purchased a new device with a brand new number. I deleted every social media account tied to my past. I closed my email addresses and opened new encrypted ones. I erased my digital footprint with surgical precision. I became a ghost to the town of Bedford. Cutting off communication is often framed as an act of cowardice by those who benefit from your presence. In reality, it requires a supreme level of discipline. It meant I would not know who attended family holidays. I would miss weddings and funerals. I would sit alone in a new city while strangers whispered lies about my character. I embraced the isolation. I took their silence and weaponized it, turning my solitude into fuel. While my family spent the next decade performing an elaborate pantomime of wealth for an audience of local gossips, I went to work. I found a tiny office space in a commercial park. I started sketching out a business plan for a medical logistics software company. I funneled every ounce of my frustration into building an empire in the dark. They believed they had banished me to a life of misery. They had no idea they had simply cleared the board, allowing me to focus entirely on my own ascent. But the distance between Boston and Bedford was not infinite. A family bound together by financial deception operates like a ticking clock. The pressure builds invisibly beneath the surface until a single structural failure brings the entire facade crashing down. My quiet climb to the top of the corporate ladder was running parallel to my brother's inevitable descent. I just needed to wait for the math to catch up with him, and the first sign that their illusions were beginning to fracture arrived exactly 5 years later, wrapped in a very modest piece of bait. The myth of the overnight corporate success is a fairy tale sold to people who have never built a company from scratch. Escaping my family did not magically transform me into a chief executive officer. The arduous 10-year gap between my departure and my return was forged in windowless rooms and fueled by cheap black coffee. I rented a tiny office space in a declining industrial park on the outskirts of Boston. The air conditioning rarely worked in the summer, and the heating failed every winter. The synthetic bristles of the commercial carpet left red marks on my cheek. I spent most nights curled in a frayed sleeping bag beneath my metal desk, listening to the hum of the aging server tower. Building Apex Medical Logistics required an endurance I did not know I possessed. The medical technology supply chain was an antiquated ecosystem dominated by men in tailored suits who played golf on Friday afternoons. I was a young woman with a fading sedan and a clipboard. Procurement directors wore heavy silver watches and patronizing smiles. They frequently looked past me during meetings, asking when my supervisor would arrive to discuss the final numbers. I learned to keep my posture rigid and my voice level. I would slide my intricate supply route maps across the table and politely inform them that I owned the numbers. I fought for every single invoice. I secured small independent clinics first, undercutting the established delivery times by a fraction of a percent. I turned 60-hour work weeks into 100-hour grinds. My isolation became my greatest asset. I had no dinner parties to attend. I had no family holidays to prepare for. I poured every ounce of my energy into the ledger. 5 years into the estrangement, my company finally stabilized. It was 2021. I moved out of the industrial park and into a glass front office overlooking the harbor. My personal bank accounts held figures that would make my former Bedford neighbors dizzy. Yet I continued to drive a modest vehicle and wear unbranded clothing. I kept a low profile. One crisp October morning, the calendar on my desk reminded me of an impending date. Richard was turning 65. A quiet curiosity took root in my chest. 5 years is a long time. It is enough time for anger to cool and for reflection to begin. I wondered if the distance had softened their arrogance. I wondered if my parents missed their daughter, or if they only missed the financial buffer I used to provide. I decided to conduct a calculated social experiment. I needed to test the waters before making my next major corporate move. I walked into a local bank branch and requested a cashier's check for $500. It was a very specific sum. It was a modest amount. It was not enough money to suggest I had found sudden wealth. It looked like the kind of money a struggling person might scrape together over several months. It painted a picture of a woman living paycheck to paycheck, trying to buy her way back into her father's good graces. I placed the check into a plain white envelope. I did not include a note. I wrote their Bedford address and dropped it into a blue postal box on the corner. Then I waited. I maintained a secure burner social media account, strictly for monitoring the blast radius of my family. I did not have to wait long. The funds cleared my bank account less than 48 hours later. Brenda did not return the envelope. She deposited the money immediately. However, she could not resist the opportunity for public theater. That evening, I logged onto the secure browser and viewed her public page. She had uploaded a photograph of a lavish steakhouse dinner. The table was covered in empty martini glasses and expensive appetizers. The caption beneath the photo was a masterclass in passive spite. She wrote about the lingering pain of family division. She informed her country club audience that she had received a piece of mail from her estranged daughter. She called the $500 a pathetic attempt at cheap guilt money. She assured her followers that her heart remained heavy, but her real family stood by her side. She finished the post by praising Bryce. She called him the true provider. She bragged that her successful son had treated them to this extravagant birthday dinner to make up for my insulting, meager offering. I sat back in my leather office chair. I stared at the glowing screen. I did not feel a single pang of hurt. I felt a profound, clarifying relief. A genuine smile touched the corners of my mouth. The diversionary bait performed flawlessly. My mother had taken the money and used it to reinforce the exact narrative I needed her to believe. They were locked into their arrogant delusion. They genuinely thought I was a failure, scraping together pennies. This red herring provided the ultimate camouflage. While Brenda laughed at my $500 check online, I was preparing to change the trajectory of my industry. That exact same week, I walked into a boardroom outfitted with mahogany paneling and panoramic city views. I sat across from the chief operations officer of a prominent New England hospital network. I did not offer a nervous smile. I presented a logistics framework that would save his hospitals millions in supply waste. He picked up a gold fountain pen and signed the document. It was my first 8-figure contract. Apex Medical Logistics officially became a regional powerhouse. I celebrated by purchasing a tailored suit and ordering takeout to my new penthouse apartment. I kept my name out of the business journals. I remained a ghost. While my net worth climbed in silence, my brother doubled down on his elaborate illusions. Bryce hosted a grand wedding. He married a woman named Jessica. I viewed the wedding photographs through the same burner account. Jessica was engineered for the Bedford ecosystem. She had perfectly highlighted blonde extensions and a smile practiced for the camera. She wore designer labels and spoke in breathless social media captions about luxury destinations. She deeply desired the affluent lifestyle my mother projected. But Jessica brought zero actual capital into the marriage. She loved the facade of wealth without understanding the mechanics of generating it. Bryce funded the extravagant wedding with invisible money. He rented a historic estate. He hired a 12-piece string quartet. He draped the reception tent in imported orchids. The town gossips praised the union, calling it the social event of the decade. I knew the math of my family too well. Bryce did not have the revenue to support a string quartet. He paid for that wedding using high-interest credit cards and fresh loans secretly co-signed by my aging parents. The parallel timelines locked permanently into place. My ascent was rooted in cold, hard numbers and executed in total silence. Their decay was loud, performative, and financed entirely by crushing debt. I spent my evenings reviewing quarterly profit margins and expanding my warehouse footprint across 3 states. They spent their evenings posing for photographs in clothes they could not afford, trying to impress neighbors who secretly scrutinized their every move. Financial gravity is an unforgiving law of nature. You can ignore it for years. You can dress it up in tailored suits and hide it behind country club memberships. But the ledger always demands a balance. I watched from a safe distance as my parents mortgaged their dignity to keep Jessica and Bryce draped in luxury. The tension within their household was building to a breaking point. They were dancing blindfolded on the edge of a sheer cliff. I realized I needed to do more than just build a profitable software company. I needed to prepare for the inevitable day their illusions shattered. My family was running out of runway. When they finally fell, I wanted to ensure I controlled the ground they landed on. I called my financial acquisitions team into my office the following morning. I instructed them to find a struggling medical debt collection agency. I was ready to diversify my portfolio. Scaling a corporate enterprise requires an eye for the invisible friction within a system. My software was successfully optimizing delivery routes for surgical supplies across 3 states. The profit margins were clean and predictable. Yet I noticed a persistent bottleneck in the accounts receivable departments of the regional clinics we serviced. Healthcare providers were bleeding capital through unpaid patient invoices and defaulting insurance claims. To streamline the back-end billing for Apex Medical Logistics, I directed my acquisitions team to locate a distressed debt collection agency. We found a failing firm operating out of a dim strip mall in Connecticut. I purchased the entity for a fraction of its projected value. I rebranded the agency, integrated my proprietary software, and began purchasing distressed consumer debt portfolios from local banks. We acquired delinquent auto loans, defaulted personal lines of credit, and abandoned secondary mortgages. It was a purely administrative maneuver. I wanted to close the loop on the healthcare economic cycle. I did not anticipate that this sterile corporate acquisition would eventually place a loaded weapon directly into my hands. I operated in a reality governed by ledgers signed in ink. Up north, my blood relatives trafficked exclusively in optics. Maintaining the illusion of affluence is significantly more expensive than actually possessing wealth. Through my monitored digital channels and the occasional loose-lipped former acquaintance, I kept a cold, clinical finger on the pulse of the Bedford estate. The extravagant wedding had drained their initial cash reserves. Now, Bryce and Jessica required a daily lifestyle commensurate with their projected social standing. Jessica posted daily updates from the driver's seat of a newly leased imported sport utility vehicle. She documented her weekend excursions to boutique wellness retreats and her hauls of overpriced organic groceries. She filmed herself unboxing expensive upholstery for a house she did not own. Bryce updated his professional networking profile with vague, meaningless titles. He called himself a principal visionary and a venture catalyst. Neither of them produced a single dollar of taxable income. They were financial parasites, feeding on a dying host. The burden of funding this elaborate theater fell entirely upon the aging shoulders of my parents. Financial institutions are not sentimental entities. When liquid cash evaporates, the equity trapped inside a property becomes the final lifeline. Richard and Brenda had spent 30 years cultivating their suburban prestige, paying down a substantial portion of their sprawling colonial home. That hard-earned equity vanished in less than 36 months. They quietly visited a secondary lender and took out a second mortgage to cover the mounting business failures and the lifestyle demands. When that well inevitably ran dry, they authorized a third. The Bedford house, with its pristine lawn and manicured hedges, was no longer an asset. It was a hollow shell, held together by high-interest promissory notes and mounting panic. The physical toll of impending ruin is rarely sudden. It manifests as a slow, quiet corrosion. Richard began to show the fraying edges of a man drowning in secret. Through photographs posted by oblivious neighbors, I watched my father deteriorate. His tailored golf shirts hung loosely from his thinning frame. The skin beneath his eyes took on a permanent, bruised gray hue. The arrogant posture he carried in the driveway 10 years ago collapsed into a subtle, defeated stoop. He stopped smiling in group pictures, looking instead like a prisoner awaiting a heavy sentence. Imagine the agonizing daily routine of a man hiding insolvency from his own wife and his social circle. He must intercept the postal carrier every afternoon to hide the brightly colored envelopes arriving from collection agencies. He must excuse himself from the dining table when an unknown number rings his cellular phone. He must stand in the checkout line at the local wine merchant, calculating which piece of plastic has enough remaining credit limit to cover a bottle of imported Bordeaux. The stress operates like a mechanical vice, tightening a fraction of an inch every single morning. While Richard swallowed antacids and rubbed the dull ache in the left side of his chest, I sat in climate-controlled boardrooms reviewing quarterly projections. My world was an ecosystem of predictable algorithms and legally binding contracts. If an equation failed to balance, I identified the error and corrected the sequence. My family lived in a distorted reality where the math was fundamentally broken. They relied on blind hope and the dangerous assumption that the next big venture would miraculously materialize to save them. They were attempting to outrun a mathematical certainty. A towering house of cards does not require a hurricane to initiate a collapse. It merely needs a shift in the prevailing wind. The spring of 2026 brought a sweltering heat wave to the Northeast. It also brought a new, brutal level of desperation to the Robinson household. Bryce missed 3 consecutive payments on his luxury vehicle, prompting threatening letters from the dealership. The country club dues went unpaid for 6 months, resulting in a discreet but humiliating suspension of dining privileges. Richard was attempting to negotiate an extension with his lenders, while simultaneously keeping up appearances at Sunday social events. He was a man sprinting on a treadmill that was accelerating far beyond his capacity to breathe. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday in early June. The air was thick with the kind of oppressive humidity that mimicked the evening they discarded me in the driveway. Richard drove his aging sedan to the local golf course. He was no longer permitted to play in the weekend member tournaments due to his delinquent account balance. The club manager, out of a misplaced sense of pity, allowed him to walk the back 9 on quiet weekday mornings. Richard carried his own clubs to save the mandatory fee of a motorized cart. He was trying to project the image of a retired gentleman enjoying a leisurely athletic stroll. He stepped onto the pristine green grass of the 9th hole. The sun beat down on his shoulders. Underneath his pressed polo shirt, his arteries were hardening against the strain. The crushing weight of carrying 3 mortgages, a bankrupt son, and a decade of elaborate lies finally demanded its toll. The illusion could no longer sustain the physical reality of his failing body. As he reached into his bag for an iron, the invisible vice gripping his chest snapped shut. He dropped to his knees, clutching his shirt, gasping for oxygen that refused to enter his lungs. The silence of my 10-year absence was about to be broken by the wail of an ambulance siren. The physical mechanics of a widowmaker myocardial infarction are swift and unforgiving. A plaque rupture occurs within the left anterior descending artery, abruptly halting the flow of oxygenated blood to the front of the heart. Time stops being measured in hours or minutes and begins to be measured in heartbeats. When Richard collapsed onto the manicured grass of the 9th hole, he was not a country club elite or a seasoned suburban patriarch. He was merely a fragile biological system experiencing a catastrophic failure. A teenage groundskeeper mowing the nearby rough noticed the fallen figure and dialed emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 7 minutes. They found my father pale and unresponsive near a sand trap. They loaded him onto a stretcher, initiating advanced life support protocols while the siren wailed across the quiet residential neighborhood. The ambulance rushed him to the local Bedford Medical Clinic. The physicians in the emergency department took one look at the electrocardiogram readout and understood they were out of their depth. A cardiac event of this severity required specialized cardiothoracic surgeons and robotic bypass capabilities. The local facility possessed neither. They stabilized his vitals just enough to authorize a transfer. Within an hour, the rhythmic thumping of a med-evac helicopter echoed over the town, airlifting Richard out of New Hampshire and pointing the nose of the chopper south toward Massachusetts. Down on the ground, a different kind of emergency was taking shape. Brenda and Bryce paced the asphalt parking lot of the local clinic. My mother clutched her designer handbag to her chest, her carefully applied makeup ruined by genuine, terrified tears. She was facing the terrifying prospect of losing her husband. Bryce, however, was facing a terror that was entirely financial. He stood near the bumper of his leased sport utility vehicle, staring blankly at the departing helicopter. A severe medical crisis operates as an impromptu financial audit. The moment Richard touched down at a major regional hospital, the administrative staff would require intake forms. They would run credit checks for premium recovery care. They would ask for insurance deductibles to be cleared. Bryce knew his parents' premium tier health coverage had lapsed months ago, replaced by a basic plan carrying an astronomical out-of-pocket requirement. He also knew his own bank accounts were overdrawn. His credit cards were maxed out from funding his extravagant wedding and his daily illusions. When the billing department presented the initial invoice, the Robinson family facade would fracture in a highly public setting. Bryce felt the walls of his carefully constructed reality closing in. He could not put a hospital deposit on his Platinum card. If the transaction was denied, his wife Jessica would ask questions. If Jessica asked questions, the entire foundation of his marriage would crumble. He needed liquid cash immediately. He needed a scapegoat. Standing in the humid summer heat, he remembered the sister he had chased out of the driveway a decade earlier. Arrogance has a remarkable ability to rewrite history. Bryce convinced himself that 10 years was a sufficient penalty for my disobedience. In his distorted logic, I had been living a quiet, lonely life, saving my modest salary, hoarding a little nest egg in some cramped Boston apartment. He assumed I was desperate for an opportunity to earn my way back into the good graces of the bloodline. He viewed me not as a person, but as an emergency fund waiting to be accessed. He opened the browser on his smartphone. Because I had erased my digital footprint and changed my contact information years ago, I did not exist on traditional social media platforms. Bryce lacked the funds to hire a legitimate private investigator. Instead, he navigated to a cheap public records database. He paid a $39 fee using a prepaid debit card to hide the transaction from his own bank statements. He typed in my maiden name and a previous address. The algorithm scraped basic telecom registries and utility records. The inexpensive software was not sophisticated enough to penetrate corporate filings, limited liability companies, or the blind trusts that shielded my wealth. It bypassed the records naming me as the chief executive officer of Apex Medical Logistics. It ignored the philanthropic foundation registered under a variation of my initials. The cheap search engine returned only a single actionable piece of data. It produced an unlisted 10-digit mobile phone number registered in the greater Boston area. Bryce stared at the glowing digits on his screen. A wave of profound relief washed over him. He possessed the lifeline. But cowards rarely deliver their own demands. He knew the sound of his voice would trigger my defenses. He required a messenger who carried the weight of maternal authority. He walked over to where Brenda was weeping softly against the brick wall of the clinic. He pulled a pen from his breast pocket and wrote the 10-digit number onto a torn piece of clinic stationery. He handed the paper to our mother. He spoke in hushed, urgent tones. He instructed her to make the contact. He framed the maneuver as a moral imperative. He told her that a daughter had an obligation to step up when the patriarch was fighting for his life. Brenda looked at the sequence of numbers. Stripped of her suburban armor and terrified of the impending hospital bills, she gripped the slip of paper like a religious artifact. She did not question the morality of demanding money from the child she had publicly disowned. Desperation silenced her pride. She believed she could simply summon the obedient 28-year-old girl from her memories. Bryce ushered his mother and his wife into the luxury vehicle. They pulled out of the clinic parking lot, merging onto the southbound interstate to follow the flight path of the helicopter. They crossed the state line, moving out of the territory of illusion and entering a jurisdiction governed by cold, hard facts. Their destination was St. Jude Regional Medical Center. To the Robinson family, St. Jude was merely a prestigious name on a map. It was a sprawling complex of modern glass and steel where skilled surgeons repaired broken hearts. They viewed the institution as a sanctuary. They remained entirely blind to the hidden architecture of the building they were rushing toward. St. Jude was not just a hospital. It was the beating heart of my corporate network. The loading docks in the rear of the facility received daily shipments managed exclusively by my routing software. The administrative board relied on my logistics framework to maintain their operating budget. Moreover, the new surgical wings and the advanced robotic bypass equipment were funded in large part by anonymous grants issued by my wealth management team. My family was driving directly into the epicenter of my power. They were speeding down the highway, preparing to demand a few $1,000s from a woman who routinely authorized transfers with 7 zeros. They believed they were arriving as esteemed guests, requesting a favor from a lowly relative. The collision course was irrevocably locked. As the imported vehicle navigated the Boston traffic, Brenda retrieved her cellular phone from her designer bag. She stared at the unlisted number Bryce had provided. The stage was set for a reunion orchestrated by panic and built upon a decade of profound underestimation. The message she was about to draft would not secure the financial rescue she anticipated. It would serve as the spark that ignited the final inferno. The view from a corner office on the 42nd floor of a Boston high-rise offers a very specific perspective on the world below. Traffic becomes a slow-moving river of headlights. Pedestrians are reduced to anonymous, shifting shapes. Up here, the chaos of daily existence is muted by double-paned, soundproof glass. I sat at a polished walnut desk, reviewing quarterly acquisition targets for my debt collection subsidiary. The air in the room was cool and crisp, maintained by an immaculate climate control system. My environment was ordered, silent, and perfectly balanced. Then the private cellular phone resting near my keyboard vibrated. This specific device was a closed circuit. I only distributed the 10-digit sequence to senior executives, wealth managers, and legal counsel. It rang perhaps twice a week. When the screen illuminated, displaying a text message from an unknown number prefixed with a New Hampshire area code, the sterile silence of my office was breached. I picked up the device. I tapped the screen to open the message thread. The text consisted of 4 terse sentences. Your father is in surgery at St. Jude's. We need you to cover the insurance deductible. Bryce's funds are tied up. Do not be selfish today. There was no greeting. There was no inquiry regarding my health or my decade of absence. There was not even a fundamental acknowledgement that the man who raised me was currently having his chest cavity opened by a surgical saw. The communication lacked a single drop of maternal warmth. It was an invoice delivered with a reprimand. It was the same condescending tone my mother used in the driveway 10 years earlier, demanding I underwrite corporate fraud. The sheer audacity of the message washed over me. For a brief, fleeting second, my pulse quickened. The old, familiar sting of rejection flared in my chest. A 28-year-old version of myself might have drafted a furious paragraph detailing the injustice of the request. A younger Raylyn might have blocked the number and retreated into tears. I did not type a response. I did not experience a surge of blind rage. 10 years of executing hostile corporate takeovers and navigating fierce boardroom negotiations had refined my emotional responses. Anger is a volatile, inefficient fuel. It clouds judgment and prompts premature action. I set the phone face down on the polished walnut surface. I took a slow, deliberate breath. The cool, conditioned air filled my lungs, stabilizing my heart rate. Brenda's message provided me with 2 crucial pieces of intelligence. First, it confirmed my father was experiencing a catastrophic medical event. Second, it verified my long-held mathematical theory. The Robinson family was officially broke. If Bryce possessed liquid capital, he would never permit my mother to reach out to the discarded daughter. By stating his funds were tied up, Brenda was inadvertently flying a flag of surrender. They were stranded in my city, trapped inside my flagship medical facility, and attempting to dictate terms from a position of absolute weakness. The chessboard was set. The pieces were moving into my territory. It was time to orchestrate the checkmate. I turned toward my primary computer monitor. I minimized the financial spreadsheets and opened a secure encrypted portal. I accessed the internal donor registry database for St. Jude's Regional Medical Center. My philanthropic foundation maintained specialized access privileges, ensuring seamless coordination for large-scale grants. I navigated to the real-time patient intake roster. I entered my father's legal name and date of birth. The system returned a match instantly. Richard Robinson, aged 75, admitted via emergency medevac, status critical, currently undergoing a robotic-assisted quadruple coronary artery bypass graft. The clinical data confirmed the severity of the crisis. I lifted my office phone from its cradle. I bypassed the standard hospital switchboard and dialed a direct internal extension. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. The voice belonged to Dr. Marcus Vance, the chief of cardiology at St. Jude's. Marcus was a brilliant surgeon and a regular fixture at my Sunday morning tennis matches. We shared a mutual respect built on our respective ascents to the top of our fields. He recognized my caller identification immediately. We exchanged brief pleasantries before I shifted the conversation to a professional cadence. I informed Marcus that the patient currently on table 4 in the primary cardiac theater was my father. I did not elaborate on the decade of estrangement or the bitter hostility defining our relationship. Medical professionals do not require family history to perform their duties. I asked him to personally oversee the surgical team and ensure every available technological resource was deployed to save Richard's life. Marcus assured me the robotic bypass was proceeding smoothly and the prognosis was cautiously optimistic. I thanked him for his vigilance. Then I issued one specific, quiet directive. I instructed Marcus to intercept the post-operative transfer orders. When Richard stabilized, I requested he be bypassed past the standard intensive care wards. I ordered a direct admission into the ultra-exclusive VIP Concierge Recovery Suite, located in the newly constructed East Wing. Marcus paused for a fraction of a second. The VIP suites at St. Jude's were generally reserved for foreign dignitaries, visiting diplomats, and major benefactors. They required substantial private pay deposits, entirely outside the bounds of standard insurance coverage. I assured him my wealth management team would authorize the necessary financial transfers to cover the premium tier care. Marcus agreed to process the upgrade, citing it as a professional courtesy to a board member. I ended the call and placed the receiver back on the cradle. I leaned back in my leather chair. A calculating calm settled over my thoughts. Upgrading my father to a concierge suite was not an act of sudden filial devotion. It was a tactical maneuver, designed to exploit my brother's defining character flaw. I understood the psychology of my family with clinical precision. When Bryce walked into the East Wing and saw the mahogany trim, the private nursing staff, and the catered waiting area, his ego would override his logic. He would refuse to admit he lacked the influence to secure such luxury. He would inevitably imply to his wife and mother that his vast network of imaginary investors had pulled strings to arrange the VIP treatment. He would build a massive pedestal of unearned glory directly in the center of the hospital. I wanted him to construct that pedestal. I wanted him to climb to the very top. A sudden plunge from a great height is far more devastating than a stumble on flat ground. I stood up from my desk. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored charcoal blazer. I walked across the plush carpet to a locked steel filing cabinet tucked discreetly behind a potted ficus tree. I retrieved a small brass key from my pocket and turned the lock. The heavy drawer slid open on oiled tracks. Inside the drawer, resting among neatly organized corporate dossiers, was a plain, slightly worn manila folder. I had maintained possession of this folder for a decade, moving it from the budget motel room to my first cramped office, and finally to this penthouse suite. It contained the original unsigned loan contract from 2016. It held the irrefutable evidence of their willingness to sacrifice my future to shield the golden child. It also contained several newer documents recently acquired by my debt collection subsidiary. I pulled the folder from the cabinet and tucked it securely under my left arm. I retrieved my car keys from the desk. I did not text my mother back. A response would signal compliance. It would indicate I was rushing to their aid, operating under their timeline. Silence generates tension. Silence forces the opponent to wonder if their demand was received, rejected, or simply ignored. I exited my corner office and rode the high-speed elevator down to the subterranean parking garage. I slid into the driver's seat of my vehicle. The engine purred to life with a quiet, muscular hum. I merged onto the dense Boston streets, navigating the familiar route toward the medical complex. 10 years ago, I drove away from my family in the dead of night, clutching a piece of paper that proved my expendability. Today, I was driving toward them, holding a portfolio of documents that proved my absolute authority. The runway of their delusions had officially ended. The long-awaited family reunion was about to commence, not in a suburban living room, but inside the sterile, unyielding walls of a hospital corridor. The tension in the air was palpable, a silent overture to the crushing reality check waiting at the concierge desk. The architecture of a modern regional medical center is designed to inspire a quiet sense of awe. St. Jude's was an imposing structure of reflective glass and brushed steel sprawling across multiple city blocks. The facility possessed a unique geometry. It housed thousands of patients and staff, yet a person could easily vanish within its labyrinth of sterile corridors and identical waiting areas. I pulled my vehicle into a reserved underground parking bay, normally utilized by the executive board. The concrete walls of the garage were damp and echoed with the sound of my footsteps. I did not march directly into the main lobby, announcing my presence like a conquering hero. Premature exposure ruins the mechanics of a carefully laid trap. The element of surprise is paramount when dealing with individuals who construct their entire identities around managing optics. If my family spotted me approaching, they would instantly adjust their posture. They would prepare their defensive arguments. I needed to observe them in their natural, unfiltered state before I tightened the snare. I paused near the sliding glass doors of the parking garage vestibule. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and retrieved a light blue surgical mask. I looped the elastic bands over my ears, covering the lower half of my face. The mask was a standard clinical precaution, blending seamlessly into the hospital environment. I reached up and pulled the dark hood of my cashmere sweater over my head, obscuring my hair and the sharp lines of my profile. I transformed myself from the chief executive officer of a regional logistics powerhouse into an anonymous visitor navigating a medical crisis. I clutched the manila folder tightly against my side and walked through the sliding doors. The air inside the vestibule was cool and smelled faintly of antiseptic. I pressed the call button for the primary elevator bank. The digital numbers above the metallic doors descended, counting down the floors with a soft, rhythmic chime. The silver doors parted. I stepped into the empty elevator car and pressed the button for the 4th floor, where the East Wing VIP suites were located. Before the doors could close, a sharp, hurried voice echoed across the vestibule. "Hold the doors, please. I am in a massive rush." A manicured hand adorned with a large, brilliant-cut diamond ring thrust between the closing panels, triggering the safety sensor. The doors slid back open, revealing my sister-in-law, Jessica. She stepped into the confined space of the elevator car, bringing a cloud of expensive floral perfume with her. Jessica had not aged gracefully over the past decade. The perfectly highlighted blonde extensions I remembered from her wedding photos were now slightly brittle. The designer handbag draped over her forearm showed visible signs of wear near the stitching. The facade of suburban luxury was cracking under the strain of continuous financial anxiety. She did not look at me. To Jessica, I was merely a hooded shape in a surgical mask, a piece of background scenery in the grand production of her life. She pressed the button for the 4th floor and immediately raised her cellular phone back to her ear, resuming a conversation she had apparently placed on hold. "Yes, Mom, I am still here." She sighed a heavy, exasperated sound. The tone was sharp, dripping with the kind of performative fatigue favored by women who believe their inconvenience is the center of the universe. I stood perfectly still, leaning against the back railing of the elevator car. The dramatic irony of the situation settled over me like a heavy, satisfying blanket. Here was the woman who married the golden child, standing inches away from the estranged sister she actively despised. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that the anonymous figure sharing her oxygen held the legal authority to dictate her financial ruin. Jessica shifted her weight, tapping a designer heel against the linoleum floor. Richard made it through the surgery. The doctor said the bypass was successful. But you would not believe the stress Bryce is under right now. He is carrying this entire family on his back. I remained motionless, taking careful mental notes. Her words confirmed the narrative Bryce had undoubtedly spun. He was playing the role of the burdened patriarch, shielding his delicate wife from the reality of his own insolvency. And get this, Jessica continued, her voice rising in pitch. Brenda actually texted Bryce's worthless, estranged sister, the one who ran off to Boston years ago. Bryce told me not to worry about it, but I know exactly what is going to happen. The elevator began its smooth ascent. The hum of the cables vibrated through the floorboards. I focused my gaze on the digital display above the door, watching the numbers climb. She is probably going to cheap out on the medical bills, Jessica sneered. Bryce said she has always been selfish. She is probably living in some tiny apartment, terrified of parting with a single dollar. It is honestly pathetic. Bryce is down at the billing desk right now handling the deposit for the VIP suite. He called some of his investor friends to get Richard transferred to the premium wing. He always knows exactly who to call. I just pray that toxic sister stays far away from us today. We do not need her negativity ruining the relief. A cold, clinical smile formed beneath my surgical mask. The depth of their delusion was truly staggering. Bryce had actually claimed credit for the VIP upgrade. He had woven my strategic silent intervention into the fabric of his own mythology. He convinced his wife that his vast network of imaginary corporate connections had secured the concierge room. He was currently standing at a billing desk, attempting to pay a 5-figure deposit using plastic cards backed by zero capital. The elevator chimed, indicating our arrival on the 4th floor. The silver doors parted, revealing the hushed, luxurious corridor of the East Wing. Jessica ended her phone call with a sharp sigh and hurried out of the car. Her heels clicked rapidly against the polished terrazzo tiles as she rushed toward the VIP concierge lobby. She was eager to rejoin her husband, eager to bask in the reflected glory of his fabricated influence. She did not cast a single backward glance at the hooded figure stepping out behind her. I stepped into the corridor, allowing Jessica to gain a substantial lead. The East Wing operated on a different frequency than the rest of the medical center. The harsh fluorescent lighting was replaced by soft, recessed fixtures. The walls were adorned with muted, tasteful artwork. The standard chaos of rolling stretchers and shouting nurses was entirely absent. This section of the hospital was designed to insulate high-net-worth individuals from the grim realities of illness. I lowered the hood of my cashmere sweater and pulled the elastic bands of the surgical mask away from my ears. I deposited the mask into a nearby biohazard receptacle. I smoothed my hair and adjusted the collar of my blazer. I took a deep, steadying breath, inhaling the faint scent of lemon polish and fresh linen. I approached the central nurses' station located just outside the double doors of the VIP lobby. The station was manned by a senior nursing director, a woman named Helen, who had worked at St. Jude's for 20 years. Helen frequently coordinated logistics directly with my software team to manage the inventory of the premium suites. She looked up from her computer terminal. Her eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Ms. Robinson," Helen said, keeping her voice discreetly low, "we did not expect you on the floor today. Your office indicated you were managing the transfer remotely." I offered a polite, professional nod. "Plans change, Helen. I need to observe the intake process for patient Robinson in suite 402. Is the family currently in the concierge lobby?" Helen glanced toward the heavy mahogany double doors leading into the private waiting area. "Yes, ma'am." The patient's wife and daughter-in-law arrived a few moments ago. The son is currently at the primary billing desk downstairs, attempting to clear the deposit requirements. I tapped the manila folder against my side. "Excellent. Please ensure the billing department does not issue any overrides for declined transactions. The standard financial protocols must be strictly enforced today." "Understood, Ms. Robinson," Helen replied, her fingers flying across her keyboard to enter the administrative note. "We will adhere to standard policy." I thanked her and turned my attention toward the heavy mahogany doors. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. Bryce was currently downstairs wrestling with the mathematical impossibility of his own lies. Jessica and Brenda were sitting comfortably in a luxury suite they did not own, waiting for a savior who possessed no actual power. I walked slowly toward the concierge lobby, my footsteps silent on the thick, premium carpet. I did not need to rush. The illusion was about to fracture, and I wanted to be standing in the room when the glass finally shattered. The tension in the air was electric, humming with the inevitable collision of carefully constructed lies and unforgiving corporate reality. The silence of the hallway gave way to the faint murmur of voices beyond the doors, signaling the beginning of the end. Through the tempered glass panel embedded in the heavy wooden doors, I observed a master class in suburban delusion. The East Wing Recovery Lounge resembled a high-end boutique hotel rather than a clinical environment. Rich, dark wood paneling lined the walls, radiating a sense of established wealth. Muted ambient lighting replaced the harsh fluorescent glare found in the standard public corridors. Expansive seating arrangements featuring supple leather sofas and polished chrome accents anchored the space. The hospital designed this private enclave to shield ultra-affluent individuals from the pedestrian anxieties of illness and mortality. It was a fortress of privilege. I watched the medical transport team wheel Richard past the lounge area and into the adjoining private recovery suite. The surgical intervention was a success. My father lay beneath pristine white blankets hooked to advanced monitors that hummed with quiet efficiency. The immediate biological threat had passed. For a normal family, this precise moment would spark profound gratitude, or perhaps a silent, reflective prayer. For the Robinson clan, survival was merely the opening act for a social media campaign. Brenda and Jessica occupied the central sofa. The initial shock of the morning evaporated, swiftly replaced by their baseline operating state. They began performing for an invisible audience. Jessica retrieved her smartphone, adjusting the camera lens to capture the opulent surroundings. She framed the shot carefully, ensuring the branded complimentary water bottles, the fresh floral arrangement, and the plush furnishings were distinctly visible in the background. She crafted a narrative of premium care, tagging the exclusive hospital location to broadcast her proximity to prestige. She was documenting her superior status for the benefit of her Bedford peers. Brenda encouraged the documentation. She leaned into the frame, attempting to arrange her features into a portrait of resilient elegance. She smoothed the fabric of her wrinkled blouse, wiping away the remnants of her earlier genuine tears. To my mother, existing in this exclusive space validated her entire worldview. It proved she belonged among the elite, even if she lacked the actual capital to rent the chair she currently occupied. They were euphoric, intoxicated by the aroma of unearned status. A few moments later, Bryce strode into the lounge. I tracked his movement from my hidden vantage point in the corridor. He had just returned from the primary billing desk on the ground floor. I knew exactly what transpired down there. I knew his transactions were denied. I knew the clerk refused to issue an override. Yet my brother did not enter the room looking defeated. He masked his internal terror beneath a thick layer of practiced bravado. He rolled his shoulders back, pushing his chest forward as he approached his wife and mother. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit jacket. Through the thick glass, I could not hear every syllable, but his body language projected an unmistakable message. Bryce was delivering a performance engineered to secure his personal mythology. He gestured broadly toward the expensive wood walls and the attentive concierge nurse standing near a small kitchenette. He was claiming ownership of the miracle. I watched his lips move, stringing together the familiar lies. He was undoubtedly spinning a tale about calling in favors from powerful investors, leveraging his imaginary corporate network to rescue his father from the standard crowded wards. He fed them the fantasy they desperately craved. He offered a reality where his name still commanded instant, unwavering respect from formidable gatekeepers. Brenda absorbed the deception eagerly. She reached out, grasping his hands. Her face glowed with intense maternal pride. She praised her son, reinforcing the pedestal he stood upon. In her eyes, Bryce was the ultimate provider, the cunning entrepreneur who navigated complex power structures to protect his bloodline. She remained blind to the faint sheen of sweat gathering at his temples, ignorant of the frantic calculations occurring behind his confident smile. Jessica beamed, tucking her arm through his. She radiated pure satisfaction. Her husband had delivered the luxury she demanded. The VIP suite validated her choice of partner, proving to her social circle that she married a man of substantial influence. She leaned her head against his shoulder, entirely unaware that the man she held was a financial ghost. He was a hollow entity, propped up by exhausted credit limits and an impending avalanche of defaulted loans. The psychological architecture of their shared delusion was fascinating to witness. They sat together on the expansive leather sofa, forming a picturesque tableau of suburban royalty. They convinced themselves their manufactured reality had saved them once again. The balloon of their arrogance inflated rapidly, stretching the thin rubber to a precarious, translucent limit. I remained in the sterile hallway, serving as a silent spectator, watching the pantomime unfold. The manila folder rested cool and heavy against my ribs. A lesser strategist might have stormed into the room immediately, interrupting the self-congratulatory celebration to expose the fraud. But vengeance, when executed properly, requires a deep understanding of timing. You must allow the target to climb as high as possible before removing the ladder. I wanted Brenda to feel the intoxicating rush of perceived victory. I wanted Jessica to post her boastful updates to the local community board. I wanted Bryce to lock himself into a lie so structural and profound that any attempt to walk it back would destroy his marriage and his fragile ego simultaneously. The higher they elevated him, the more catastrophic the gravitational pull would eventually become. I studied Bryce's subtle movements. Despite the confident posture, his right foot tapped a frantic rhythm against the plush carpet. His eyes darted toward the entryway every few seconds. His bravado functioned as a brittle shell. He knew the financial grace period was exceptionally short. The billing department at St. Jude's operated with ruthless efficiency. While he temporarily escaped the ground floor clerk, the administrative protocols for the East Wing dictated that premium deposits must be secured before the patient officially woke from anesthesia. The bill was coming due. He was a cornered animal, pretending to be an apex predator. He understood a financial counselor was inevitably tracing his steps up to the 4th floor to collect the mandatory $10,000 retainer. He had no plan to produce those funds. He was relying on the desperate hope that his mother had successfully bullied me into transferring the money remotely. The tension in my shoulders coiled tight. The air in the corridor seemed to thin out, anticipating the impending rupture. I leaned back against the wall, allowing the quiet hum of the hospital ventilation to center my focus. Let them enjoy the luxury trim. Let them bask in the concierge service. Their borrowed status functioned as a temporary loan with an astronomical interest rate. They were celebrating a victory they did not earn inside a fortress they could not afford. The true architect of their salvation was standing right outside their door, holding the receipts they spent a decade trying to bury. And the individual tasked with shattering their delusion was currently stepping out of the elevator. A woman wearing a tailored slate gray skirt suit walked briskly past my hidden vantage point in the corridor. She carried a sleek digital tablet resting in the crook of her arm. A silver nameplate pinned to her lapel identified her as Mrs. Higgins, the senior financial counselor for the East Wing. Her entire professional existence revolved around a singular, crucial task. She separated the actual millionaires from the tourists attempting to overstay their welcome. I remained silent against the wall, watching her approach the heavy mahogany doors of the recovery lounge. The joyful atmosphere inside the private suite evaporated the second Higgins crossed the threshold. She introduced herself, offering a polite, practiced smile that did not extend to her eyes. She expressed her sincere gladness regarding my father's successful bypass operation. Her voice was soothing, yet carried a distinct undertone of unyielding institutional authority. She pivoted seamlessly from medical updates to financial obligations. The counselor explained that the concierge tier operated outside standard insurance protocols. She required an upfront private pay retainer of $10,000 to maintain the room assignment. Bryce stood up from the leather sofa. He smoothed his silk tie, projecting the aura of a man inconvenienced by petty administrative bureaucracy. He offered his wife and mother a reassuring wink. He retrieved a slim designer wallet from the breast pocket of his jacket and extracted a heavy metal platinum card. He handed the plastic to the counselor with a dismissive flick of his wrist, as if paying the extravagant fee was a bothersome chore beneath his notice. Higgins retrieved a portable terminal from her jacket pocket. She inserted the chip. The electronic chime echoed through the hushed room. It was the exact same unforgiving tone I heard down in the ground floor lobby an hour earlier. Declined. Higgins kept her facial expression entirely neutral. She stated the banking institution denied the authorization request. Bryce shifted his weight from his left foot to his right, A faint sheen of perspiration materialized on his forehead. He blamed a sudden security alert, claiming his wealth management team must have flagged the out-of-state medical charge as fraudulent activity. He pulled a second card from his wallet. This one featured a black rewards tier design. He shoved it into the slot on the terminal. The machine processed the data for 3 agonizing seconds. Beep. Denied. The air in the room grew heavy and suffocating. The performance was unraveling in real time. Jessica dropped her smartphone onto the sofa cushion. The color drained rapidly from her cheeks, leaving her skin a stark, chalky white. She stared at her husband. This was the man who supposedly commanded vast networks of corporate power. She watched him fumble with useless pieces of plastic while a hospital administrator waited with a blank, unforgiving stare. The foundation of her marriage rested on the assumption of endless capital. That foundation was currently dissolving beneath her designer heels. Bryce offered a tight, nervous laugh. He produced a third card, his fingers trembling slightly as he handed it over. The counselor ran the magnetic stripe. The result remained identical. The terminal rejected the transaction. Brenda recognized the impending collapse. Her social survival instinct engaged immediately. She could not let the hospital staff witness their insolvency. She could not endure the humiliation of being evicted from the premium wing. She sprang from her seat, stepping between her son and the billing official. She announced in a loud, brittle voice that her daughter was en route to handle the incidental expenses. She painted me as the designated family accountant, a subordinate summoned from the shadows to manage the trivial financial details while the important relatives comforted the patient. This was my cue. I pushed the heavy wooden doors open. The brass hinges operated silently, but my physical arrival struck the room like a thunderclap. I stepped onto the plush carpet, entering their domain. 10 years of estrangement dissolved in a single frozen second. The last time my mother saw me, I was wearing a cheap cotton blouse, standing in a humid driveway, holding a fraudulent contract. Today, I wore a tailored charcoal blazer that cost more than her current automobile. I carried the plain manila folder tucked securely under my left arm. I did not look like the scared 28-year-old girl they banished. I looked like the chief executive officer I had become. Brenda's mouth fell open. Bryce took a physical step backward, his shoulders slumping. Jessica recovered from the initial shock faster than her in-laws. Her innate need to defend her territory overrode her confusion. She sprang from the leather sofa, inserting herself directly into my path. She blocked the short hallway leading toward my father's recovery bed. She thrust her chin forward, playing the fiercely protective gatekeeper. Her eyes narrowed, taking in my understated clothing without recognizing the expensive tailoring. "You cannot be here, Raylan," she hissed. Her voice shook with a mixture of fear and indignation. "Bryce arranged this premium room for his father. We do not need your toxic energy ruining his recovery. Did you even bring the check?" She stood there, defending a kingdom built on quicksand. She genuinely believed her husband orchestrated the VIP experience. She assumed I was merely a walking bank account, ordered to appear and settle the balance. I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink back from her confrontational posture. I stopped a few feet away from her and met her hostile glare with deadpan corporate ice. I studied the brittle extensions in her hair and the frayed stitching on her handbag. I formulated a statement engineered to strip away her remaining dignity and expose the raw truth of her existence. "Jessica," I said, keeping my tone even and clinical, "you are standing in a doorway you cannot afford. You are guarding a man who bankrupted his own parents just to fund your illusions. I suggest you sit down." The words landed with the precision of a surgical scalpel. Jessica's eyes widened in horror. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She glanced back at Bryce, seeking a denial, seeking reassurance that my accusation was a lie. Bryce provided no such comfort. The words struck a nerve buried deep within his fragile ego. The reality of his failure had been spoken aloud in front of his wife and a hospital official. He erupted. His face flushed a dark mottled crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against his silk collar. He stepped forward, shoving past Jessica to close the distance between us. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest, shouting demands for respect. He accused me of harboring a petty grudge, attempting to ruin a family emergency with baseless insults. The carefully cultivated facade of the successful visionary entrepreneur shattered into jagged, pathetic pieces. He was just a broke, middle-aged man screaming in a hospital corridor. The fuse was officially lit. The gatekeeper was neutralized, and the golden child was currently hyperventilating. This chaotic breakdown cleared the path for the true architect of the decade-long disaster to step up to the firing line. Brenda was watching the scene unfold, her mind scrambling to regain control of a narrative that was spiraling far beyond her reach. The next confrontation would not be a mere skirmish. It would serve as the final dismantling of the matriarch. Bryce ran out of breath. His chest heaved beneath the tailored fabric of his suit. His shouting echoed against the wood-paneled walls before dying out, leaving a strained, uncomfortable quiet in its wake. The senior financial counselor, Mrs. Higgins, took a discreet step backward, retreating toward the hallway. She recognized the toxic signature of a family implosion and sought to remove herself from the blast radius. Before I could address my brother, Brenda engaged her primary defense mechanism. She stepped into the space between us. My mother possessed an uncanny ability to summon tears on command. It was a skill honed over decades of manipulating country club committees and evading local creditors. Her eyes grew wide and bright, brimming with manufactured sorrow. She reached out and placed a trembling hand upon Bryce's shoulder, projecting the image of a protective matriarch shielding her besieged son. "Raylin," she began, her voice trembling, with perfect theatrical precision. "This is not the time or the place for your lingering resentments. We are standing in a hospital. Your father is hooked to machines, fighting to draw his next breath." She paused, allowing the gravity of her statement to settle over the room. She glanced sideways, ensuring Jessica and the billing official were observing her performance. Then she deployed the gaslighting strategy she had perfected 10 years earlier in our gravel driveway. She attempted to rewrite reality while staring directly at the facts. Bryce orchestrated this entire premium recovery experience, she continued, her tone, shifting from sorrowful to gently reprimanding. He utilized his extensive corporate network to ensure Richard received the finest care available. Unfortunately, his wealth management team is currently navigating a complex liquidation protocol. Transferring substantial offshore assets requires a brief waiting period. She offered a reassuring smile to her daughter-in-law, attempting to patch the gaping holes in Jessica's fracturing worldview. Then Brenda turned her attention back to me. The maternal warmth vanished, replaced by a rigid, dictatorial edge. She pointed a manicured finger toward the open double doors leading to the corridor. "We need you to be useful today, Raylin. Go downstairs to the primary intake desk, pay the incidental insurance deductible, and clear this minor deposit hurdle. Your brother has already handled the heavy lifting. You can manage the trivial paperwork. Do not force us to beg you to care about your own family." The orchestration was brilliant in its sheer audacity. Brenda was actively assigning the glory of my silent intervention to her broke son, while simultaneously ordering me to empty my wallet to maintain the illusion. She assumed I still carried the deep-seated conditioning of my youth. She believed the inherent social pressure of the luxury lounge, combined with the presence of an authority figure like Mrs. Higgins, would compel me to lower my head and obey. She expected me to slink away to the ground floor, playing the obedient bank account. 10 years ago, her strategy would have succeeded. A younger version of myself would have succumbed to the suffocating guilt. I would have handed over my debit card just to stop the confrontation and buy a momentary, fleeting sense of belonging. But the woman standing in the East Wing Recovery Lounge did not seek their approval. I did not require an invitation to their table. I owned the building. I did not yell. I did not shed a tear. I did not offer a defensive argument attempting to prove my own worth. Arguing with a delusion only grants it legitimacy. Instead, I walked slowly toward the center of the seating area. A low-polished glass coffee table sat between the leather sofas, holding a crystal vase filled with fresh white hydrangeas. I stood beside the table. I lifted my left arm and placed the plain manila folder onto the pristine glass surface. The dull thud of the thick paper striking the table severed the remaining tension in the room. Every eye tracked my movement. Bryce swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his silk collar. Brenda folded her arms across her chest, a subtle physical manifestation of mounting panic. I reached down and flipped open the heavy cover of the folder. The scent of aged paper and fresh printer ink mingled with the faint aroma of the floral arrangement. I retrieved a stack of stapled documents. These were not handwritten notes or emotional letters. They were official county records, retrieved by my acquisitions team, stamped with authentic municipal seals. I slid the first document across the smooth glass, positioning it directly in front of my mother. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice level and entirely devoid of emotion, "Bryce does not possess offshore accounts. He is not navigating a complex liquidation protocol. He does not have any liquid assets." I tapped my index finger against the top page. The harsh black and white ink starkly contrasted with the opulent surroundings. I summarized the text printed on the paper. I explained that her son was currently carrying 3 distinct mechanical liens against his primary shell company. I noted that his corporate charter was revoked by the state treasury due to unpaid franchise taxes. I pulled a second document from the folder and laid it beside the first. I detailed his personal credit profile. I listed the defaulted revolving accounts and the maxed out limits on every single piece of plastic residing in his designer wallet. Jessica leaned forward, staring down at the paperwork. Even reading the text upside down, the bold red numbers indicating delinquent balances were universally comprehensible. A low, breathless gasp escaped her lips. Brenda refused to look at the table. She kept her gaze fixed on my face, her jaw locked in a rigid, defensive line. She shook her head side to side, a slow, rhythmic denial of the incoming truth. She tried to interrupt me, claiming the papers were forged, insisting I was orchestrating a vindictive smear campaign out of pure jealousy. I ignored her protest. I reached into the folder one final time. I withdrew the third document. This specific piece of paper held a distinct weight. It was the keystone pulling their entire house of cards into the dirt. I set it down with deliberate care. I looked directly into my mother's eyes, ensuring she could not look away. I explained the nature of the third document. It was the secondary mortgage recorded against the colonial home in Bedford. The house she cherished, the estate she utilized to protect her country club's superiority. I pointed to the final paragraph, highlighting the bolded text. Issued by the original lending institution. You secretly leveraged your own home to fund his illusions. I stated the undeniable fact, echoing off the mahogany walls. And because he failed to generate a single dollar of actual revenue, that secondary note is now 60 days past due. The bank initiated the pre-foreclosure process last week. You are standing in a premium hospital suite, demanding I pay a deposit while your own residential property is slipping into default. The silence that descended upon the recovery lounge was stark. It was a heavy void, possessing a physical weight pressing down on the occupants of the room. The rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitors in the adjoining suite seemed to amplify, marking the steady passage of a reality they could no longer deny. Brenda's carefully constructed composure finally broke. The rigid set of her shoulders collapsed. She looked down at the coffee table. Her eyes scanned the municipal seals and the delinquent financial figures. Her manicured hands began to shake with a frantic, uncontrollable tremor. She reached out, attempting to gather the papers, but her fingers lacked the coordination to grasp the edges. She pulled her hands back, pressing them against her mouth to stifle a rising sob. The decade of lies, the elaborate social media campaigns, the arrogant posturing in suburban driveways, it all dissolved upon contact with those 3 printed pages. The truth was laid bare in unforgiving black and white ink. Bryce stood frozen near the entryway, his bravado entirely extinguished. Jessica backed away from him, pressing her spine against the wall, as if proximity to her husband might infect her with his poverty. I stood over the table, observing the wreckage of my family. I felt no triumph. I felt no joy. I merely experienced the cold, clean satisfaction of a balanced ledger. They spent 30 years treating me like an expendable resource while worshiping a parasite. They exiled me into the dark, expecting me to fade away. They never considered that the dark was the perfect environment to cultivate true, devastating power. The matriarch was neutralized. The golden child was exposed. The gatekeeper was horrified. The ambush had failed spectacularly, rebounding to decimate the architects. But the true reckoning, the final structural shift that would sever their remaining tether to arrogance, had not yet occurred. The paperwork proved their ruin. The individual preparing to enter the room would prove my supremacy. Footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond the open double doors. The steady, confident stride belonged to an individual accustomed to commanding authority. Before Brenda could formulate a new, desperate lie, the heavy wooden doors swung open wider, introducing the final catalyst into the fractured ecosystem of the East Wing Lounge. The heavy wooden doors bordering the VIP recovery lounge swung inward on their oiled brass hinges. The individual crossing the threshold did not project the frantic energy of a medical emergency. He moved with the measured, deliberate stride of a man who governed the very walls surrounding us. This was Dr. Aris Thorne. He served as the chief administrator and head of the executive board for St. Jude's Regional Medical Center. Dr. Thorne was a formidable figure in the New England healthcare sector. He spent his days securing federal grants, negotiating with pharmaceutical conglomerates, and courting philanthropic endowments. He wore an immaculate charcoal pinstripe suit that spoke of quiet, old money. A silver watch gleamed discreetly at his wrist. He possessed an aura of unquestioned institutional command. The senior financial counselor, Mrs. Higgins, immediately straightened her posture and took a deferential step backward upon registering his arrival. The introduction of this high-ranking official triggered a fascinating psychological reflex within my mother. When the human brain faces a trauma it cannot process, it frequently retreats into familiar, comfortable scripts. Brenda had just spent the last 5 minutes staring at official municipal documents proving her imminent residential foreclosure and her son's undeniable insolvency. The reality of her ruin was resting on the glass coffee table mere inches from her trembling hands. Yet the moment a distinguished authority figure entered the room, her suburban survival instinct hijacked her rational thought. Brenda turned away from the damning paperwork. She smoothed the front of her wrinkled blouse, forcing her rigid shoulders to relax into a posture of practiced elegance. She inhaled a sharp breath, burying her panic beneath a thick layer of country club armor. In her distorted worldview, Dr. Thorne was merely another gatekeeper to be charmed. She assumed the chief administrator had caught wind of a minor billing glitch in the East Wing and arrived to personally apologize to her wealthy, influential son. She stepped away from the seating area, intercepting his path across the plush carpet. She extended her right hand, offering the bright, artificial smile she utilized at charity galas and tennis luncheons. Dr. Thorne, she began, her voice adopting a high, sophisticated cadence. I am Brenda Robinson. We are so very grateful for the premium care you have provided for my husband this afternoon. My son Bryce was just settling the incidental accounts downstairs. There seems to have been a trivial miscommunication with the banking terminals, but he is handling the logistics as we speak. She gestured gracefully toward Bryce, who remained frozen near the corridor entrance. Bryce looked nothing like a titan of industry handling minor logistics. His face was devoid of color. His suit hung limply on his frame. He resembled a man waiting for a trap door to open beneath his feet. Dr. Thorne paused. He looked at Brenda's outstretched hand and then shifted his gaze toward the sweating, distressed man she identified as her son. A profound, polite bafflement registered across the administrator's features. Dr. Thorne negotiated with actual billionaires. He dined with software magnates and venture capitalists who controlled global markets. He possessed an acute radar for authentic influence. The individual standing before him registered as nothing more than background static. He offered Brenda a brief, tight smile of professional courtesy. He did not accept her handshake. Instead, he stepped smoothly around her, bypassing her entirely as if she were a mislaid piece of furniture. His eyes scanned the room and locked onto my position near the coffee table. The polite bafflement vanished from his face, replaced instantly by genuine warmth and deep professional respect. He closed the distance between us, extending both of his hands to grasp my right hand in a firm, welcoming grip. "Raylin," he said, his voice projecting clear and strong across the silent room. "I was informed you were on the floor. I wanted to come down here and personally ensure your father was resting comfortably." He did not call me Ms. Robinson. He used my first name, signaling a relationship built on equal footing and mutual regard. The counselor, Mrs. Higgins, watched this interaction with wide eyes, quickly reevaluating the power dynamic of the entire suite. "It is good to see you, Aris," I replied, returning his firm handshake. The surgical team performed exceptionally well. Marcus provided me with a comprehensive update on the bypass procedure. "Excellent," Dr. Thorne nodded, visibly pleased. "We strive for perfection, especially for our most valued partners. I know today is a difficult personal day for you, but the executive board is currently gathering in the main atrium. We are finishing the final preparations. We want to be ready to proceed with the dedication ceremony this afternoon whenever you give us the green light, CEO." He spoke the three letters with casual, effortless reverence. CEO, Chief Executive Officer. The title hung in the sterile, conditioned air of the recovery lounge. It was a brief, unassuming acronym, but it struck the Robinson family like a physical blow. The words severed the final frayed threads of their decade-long delusion. Brenda's jaw unhinged. Her mouth opened, but the vocal cords refused to produce a coherent sound. She turned her head, slowly tracking the interaction between the hospital administrator and the daughter she had banished. The artificial smile slid off her face, leaving a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Rice stopped breathing. His chest froze mid-inhalation. The narrative he had spun for 30 years, the story where he was the visionary genius and I was the expendable subordinate, shattered into microscopic fragments. He stared at me with vacant, terrified eyes, processing the impossible reality that the woman he tried to saddle with a fraudulent loan was now commanding the respect of the man who ran the hospital. Jessica retreated another step, pressing her designer handbag against her stomach as if it could shield her from the incoming devastation. The realization dawned on her with brutal clarity. The hooded figure she had insulted in the elevator, the estranged sister she had mocked as a pathetic cheapskate, was currently being deferred to by the highest authority in the building. CEO. Brenda whispered, the syllable scraped against her dry throat, sounding like a dry leaf skittering across pavement. I turned my attention away from Dr. Thorne and focused my gaze on my mother. Her eyes were wide, pleading for the universe to rewind the clock and restore her comfortable lies. She looked at the manila folder on the table and then back to my tailored blazer, finally seeing the impeccable stitching and the imported fabric. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, measured cadence of a corporate leader dissecting a failed merger. I did not just pay the $10,000 deposit for this room. Mom, I stated the undeniable facts, echoing against the mahogany paneling. I did not just clear the incidental insurance deductibles. I pointed a finger toward the closed door of the adjoining medical suite, where the rhythmic hum of the life support machinery kept my father tethered to the living world. I funded the surgical robotics program that cracked his chest open and repaired his heart. I continued holding her gaze until she blinked. My foundation issued the anonymous grant that purchased those machines. Bryce did not call any investor buddies. He did not pull any strings to secure this concierge suite. He possesses zero influence in this building. I shifted my focus to my brother. He flinched visibly as my eyes locked onto his. The charge nurse down at the intake desk saw my maiden name on the emergency transfer forms. I explained, stripping away the final remnants of his fabricated glory. She flagged the file. The administration upgraded Patient Robinson to the VIP wing as a professional courtesy to me. You spent the last hour claiming ownership of a miracle you could not even begin to afford. You took credit for my capital. Bryce opened his mouth to formulate a defense. He wanted to scream. He wanted to call me a liar and demand Dr. Thorne expel me from the premises. But the presence of the chief administrator neutralized his aggression. He realized any further outburst would only cement his humiliation in front of the executive staff. He closed his mouth, swallowing the bitter ash of his ruined pride. Jessica let out a soft, wounded whimper. Her entire social identity was tied to the assumption of Bryce's superiority. She had mocked me to her friends. She had barred my entry to the room. Now she was trapped in a luxury suite, realizing she was married to a destitute fraud, while her despised sister-in-law reigned over an empire. Brenda looked like a sailor watching her ship sink beneath the waves. The undeniable truth washed over her, drowning the last of her country club pretenses. She had sacrificed her relationship with her daughter to protect a golden child who turned out to be made of cheap, rusting tin. She had leveraged her own home into foreclosure to fund a mirage, and the child she threw away, the one she deemed worthless and selfish, had grown in the dark, accumulating enough power to buy the very ground they stood upon. Dr. Thorne cleared his throat, a polite administrative sound designed to bridge the uncomfortable silence. He sensed the deep familial fracture, but his primary concern remained the hospital agenda. "Take all the time you need, Raylin," Dr. Thorne said, stepping back toward the corridor. "The board will wait in the atrium. We can delay the unveiling until you are ready." I thanked him, assuring him I would be down shortly. He exited the lounge, pulling the heavy wooden doors shut behind him. The click of the brass latch sounded like a gavel striking a judge's block. The verdict was delivered. The illusions were dead. We were alone once more. The air in the room was dense, charged with a volatile mixture of shame and impending ruin. My family stood paralyzed, trapped between the damning paperwork on the coffee table and the staggering revelation of my corporate identity. They had nothing left to say. Their scripts were burned. But the ledger was not yet fully reconciled. I had exposed their lies and demonstrated my authority, but I still needed to reveal the ultimate consequence of their financial recklessness. I reached back toward the manila folder, preparing to deliver the final structural blow that would legally sever their remaining ties to the life they once knew. The click of the brass door latch settled into the room, carrying the finality of a closing vault. Dr. Thorne was gone, leaving a profound and terrifying vacuum in his wake. Bryce broke the quiet. He shook his head, side to side, a rapid, jerky motion. A harsh, frantic laugh tore from his throat. "It is a trick," he stammered. His voice cracked, pitching upward into a thin, desperate register. He turned toward his wife, holding his hands up, palms facing outward, as if physically warding off the truth. "She is lying, Jessica. The administrator is mistaken. She is just a mid-level worker. She drove a beat-up sedan. She lived in a cheap rental." He paced a tight, erratic circle near the entryway. He unbuttoned his tailored jacket. His chest heaved. He was a man clinging to the wreckage of a sunken ship, refusing to acknowledge the dark water rising around his neck. He looked at Brenda, seeking an ally, seeking the maternal shield that had protected him for 3 decades. "Mom, tell her to stop. Tell her this is a joke." Brenda did not speak. She remained frozen near the coffee table, staring at my charcoal blazer and the calm, unyielding expression on my face. The cognitive dissonance was tearing her apart, but the undeniable deference shown by the hospital executive had finally penetrated her thick country club armor. She knew it was not a trick. I ignored my brother's pathetic unraveling. I turned my attention back to the polished glass surface of the coffee table. The manila folder still contained one final document. It was the specific piece of paper I had traveled 10 years and several dozen miles to deliver. I reached out and rested my fingertips against the thick, textured cover. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. The time for corporate maneuvers and administrative reveals was over. It was time to reconcile the original outstanding debt. "Do you remember the summer of 2016?" I asked, keeping my tone conversational and mild. "Do you remember the humid night you cornered me by my car? You handed me a stack of stapled papers and demanded I take out a $50,000 personal loan to cover Bryce's missing capital. Brenda flinched. The memory was clearly etched into her mind. She dropped her gaze, unable to maintain eye contact. I flipped the folder open. I extracted the final document. It was a heavy legal parchment bound with a blue municipal seal. I held it up, allowing the recessed lighting to illuminate the crisp black text. You attempted to force my signature, I continued, but the most insidious part of your plan was buried on page 4, paragraph 3. You secretly pledged the Bedford house as collateral to secure the funding. When I refused to sign that fraudulent contract, I took the paperwork with me. But Bryce's financial hemorrhage did not stop when I drove away. You still needed cash. So you found secondary lenders who asked fewer questions and charged exorbitant interest rates. You signed the equity of your home away to keep your son draped in imported silk. Bryce stopped pacing. He stood rigid, listening to the autopsy of his own failures. The American financial system operates on a very specific set of mechanics, I explained, stepping slowly around the coffee table to close the distance between myself and my parents. Primary banking institutions despise carrying toxic assets on their ledgers. When you missed your consecutive payments on those secondary and tertiary mortgages, your lender initiated pre-foreclosure. Then they packaged your defaulted residential note into a bundle of distressed consumer debt. They sold that toxic portfolio to the secondary market for pennies on the dollar to clear their books. I slid the heavy legal parchment across the smooth glass. It stopped directly in front of Brenda's trembling hands. It did not feature the logo of their original hometown bank. It bore the sharp, modern crest of the debt collection agency I had acquired 2 years prior. I diversified my corporate portfolio recently, I said, watching the color drain entirely from my brother's face. My software subsidiary purchased that specific distressed debt package. The words hung in the air, sharp and lethal. The mathematical trap I had spent a decade designing finally snapped shut, severing their last remaining tether to the suburban elite. You do not owe the bank anymore, Mom, I stated, delivering the definitive structural blow. You owe me. I hold the promissory notes. I possess the exclusive legal authority to initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings. I literally hold the deed to the house you are standing in. The sheer reversal of power was realized in a single, breathtaking moment. The psychological architecture of the Robinson family collapsed into a pile of worthless rubble. The Golden Boy was exposed not as a visionary entrepreneur, but as a parasitic drain who consumed his parents' entire net worth. The discarded daughter, the scapegoat sent into the wilderness to absorb their shame, was revealed as the unforgiving landlord. A sharp, visceral sound shattered the heavy silence. It was a wet, ragged sob. Jessica collapsed onto the leather sofa. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with violent, uncontrollable weeping. The tears ruined her meticulously applied makeup, sending dark streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. Her grief was not born of sympathy for her ailing father-in-law. Her tears were the raw, selfish manifestation of a woman realizing her entire future was a mirage. She looked up at Bryce, her eyes filled with profound revulsion. She had married a pauper. She had tied her legal and social identity to a man who possessed nothing but maxed-out credit limits and fraudulent business cards. Her dreams of country club memberships, luxury vacations, and sprawling estates evaporated. She was legally bound to a hollow ghost who had just been evicted from his own fabricated kingdom. She pulled her designer handbag tight against her chest, rocking back and forth, emitting a continuous, high-pitched wail. Bryce offered no comfort to his sobbing wife. His knees buckled. The strength vanished from his legs, sending him slumping heavily into the adjacent armchair. He stared blankly at the beige carpet. His jaw hung slack. He was stripped of every single defense mechanism he had relied upon for his entire adult life. He could not charm his way out of a legal deed transfer. He could not bully a municipal record. He was reduced to a zero balance. Brenda remained immobile near the glass table. She looked like a marble statue frozen in a state of perpetual horror. The estate she utilized to project her superiority, the manicured lawns where she hosted her garden parties, the dining room where she curated her image, it all belonged to the child she deemed worthless. She was a tenant, occupying a space via the silent, unearned mercy of her estranged daughter. I observed the wreckage. I felt the smooth, cool fabric of my tailored blazer against my wrists. I felt the steady, rhythmic beating of my own heart. The debt was reconciled. The invoice they handed me 10 years ago was marked paid in full. I did not offer them a comforting platitude. I did not extend a hand to help them up from the floor. They had engineered this precise outcome through their own arrogance and deceit. I merely provided the mirror, reflecting their authentic reflections. The medical machinery in the adjoining suite continued its steady, mechanical hum, keeping my father anchored to the living world. He was resting mere feet away, entirely oblivious to the fact that his legacy had just been legally dismantled and redistributed. I reached down and closed the manila folder securing the documents back inside the plain paper cover. I tucked it neatly under my arm. "A hospital administrator is waiting," I said, my voice breaking through Jessica's pathetic sobbing. "The public press is gathered in the main atrium. It is time to go downstairs." I turned my back on the ruined matriarch, the weeping wife, and the broken golden boy. I walked toward the heavy mahogany doors exiting the concierge lounge without checking to see if they followed. They had no choice but to fall in line. Their kingdom was gone. The only remaining path forward led directly into the center of my territory, where the final public unveiling awaited them. I stepped over the threshold of the recovery lounge, leaving the suffocating despair of my family behind me. The hallway air felt remarkably crisp and clean. A few paces down the corridor, Dr. Thorne stood, waiting near a set of brushed steel elevator doors. He held a sleek leather folio, reviewing a printed agenda. He looked up as I approached, offering a polite nod. "Ray Lynn," he said, his voice carrying a warm, professional cadence. "The executive board is ready for you. The press pool has gathered downstairs, and the caterers have finished staging the reception area." I paused, allowing the reality of his words to drift back into the open doorway of the private suite. My mother and brother had spent their entire lives chasing the spotlight. They engineered elaborate fictions just to secure a fleeting glance from local gossips. They hungered for an audience. I decided to grant them the ultimate front row seat. I turned back to face the room. Bryce remained slumped in the armchair, staring at the carpet. Jessica was wiping the ruined makeup from her cheeks with a trembling hand. Brenda stood frozen near the coffee table, looking like a hollow shell of the matriarch she once portrayed. "You should come to the atrium," I told them, keeping my tone even and pleasant. "You have always loved a public event." I did not wait for their verbal consent. I turned and joined Dr. Thorne at the elevator. A few seconds later, the heavy mahogany doors of the lounge slowly opened wider. My family emerged. They did not resemble the arrogant suburban elites who had swaggered into the hospital an hour prior. They moved like prisoners of war marching toward a tribunal. Bryce shuffled his feet, his tailored suit now appearing wrinkled and oversized on his defeated frame. Brenda clutched her handbag tightly against her stomach, using the designer leather as a futile shield against the incoming reality. Jessica kept her head bowed, attempting to hide her tear-streaked face behind her brittle blonde hair. We entered the spacious glass elevator car. The descent to the main floor was agonizingly quiet. The transparent walls offered a sweeping view of the grand atrium below. The space was transformed into an elegant reception venue. High top tables draped in crisp white linen dotted the polished terrazzo floor. A string quartet played a soft classical overture in the corner. Local journalists and hospital photographers stood near the center, adjusting their camera lenses. Executive board members wearing expensive dark suits mingled near a towering marble wall, currently obscured by a heavy velvet tarp. This was not a rented tent decorated with imported orchids purchased on credit. This was an authentic display of institutional power and generational wealth. The elevator doors parted. Dr. Thorne guided me toward the front of the gathering, directing me to a reserved viewing area flanking a sleek acrylic podium. I gestured for my family to stand beside me. They obeyed without a single word of protest. The magnetic pull of authentic authority stripped them of their defiance. They stood in the periphery, shrinking under the bright lights of the camera flashes. A specialized medical transport team appeared from a side corridor, navigating a high-tech recovery chair through a cleared pathway in the crowd. The patient reclining in the chair was Richard. My father looked incredibly fragile. The robust, arrogant patriarch who banished me in a humid driveway was gone, replaced by a pale, exhausted man tethered to a portable oxygen tank. Thin plastic tubing ran beneath his nose. A heart monitor rested on a tray near his arm, quietly blipping a steady, rhythmic verification of his survival. The surgical saw that opened his sternum had also cracked the foundation of his invincibility. The nurses positioned his chair near the front of the audience, directly adjacent to where Brenda and Bryce stood. Richard blinked, fighting against the lingering fog of the anesthesia. He looked at his wife and his son. He expected to see them radiating triumph. He assumed they would be celebrating his successful operation and boasting about the premium care they had secured. Instead, he saw 3 broken, terrified people avoiding his gaze. Then his eyes drifted to the right and locked onto me. Confusion knitted his brow. He stared at my charcoal blazer and the calm, clinical posture I maintained. He could not comprehend why the discarded daughter, the one he declared worthless, was standing alongside the hospital executives. Dr. Thorne stepped up to the acrylic podium. The low murmur of the crowd died down instantly, replaced by an expectant hush. He tapped the microphone, testing the audio feed, before looking out over the assembled press and board members. "Good afternoon," Dr. Thorne began, his voice echoing clearly across the vast geometric space of the atrium. "Today marks a historic milestone for St. Jude's Regional Medical Center. We are gathered to celebrate the future of cardiac care in New England and to honor an unprecedented philanthropic commitment that makes this future possible." The cameras clicked, capturing the momentous occasion. Bryce stared at the floor, unable to endure the impending revelation. Brenda squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact. "For many years, our surgical teams have performed miracles using standard protocols." Dr. Thorne continued, gesturing toward the covered marble wall behind him. "But remaining at the forefront of modern medicine requires more than just skill. It requires visionary leadership. It requires partners who understand that investing in regional healthcare infrastructure saves thousands of lives. We recently received an extraordinary endowment from a titan of the medical logistics industry. This grant fully funded our new surgical robotics wing, an advancement that has already begun saving lives today." Dr. Thorne looked directly at me, offering a respectful nod. Richard tracked the administrator's gaze. The confusion on my father's face deepened, shifting into a nascent, horrifying realization. "It is my distinct privilege to unveil the new cornerstone of this institution," Dr. Thorne announced, stepping away from the podium and grasping a braided gold cord attached to the ceiling rigging. He pulled the cord. The heavy velvet tarp surrendered its grip, sliding smoothly down the face of the stone. The fabric pooled onto the terrazzo floor, exposing a wide, pristine expanse of white Carrara marble. Embedded directly into the stone were towering gilded letters, catching the ambient light and reflecting a brilliant, permanent glow. The text read, "The Raylyn Robinson Cardiac Center." A polite wave of applause rippled through the crowd. The string quartet transitioned into a triumphant, soaring chord. The photographers snapped dozens of rapid-fire images documenting the gleaming letters and the executives standing beneath them. I did not look at the cameras. I looked at Richard. My father stared at the wall. His eyes traced the golden letters spelling out the name of the child he threw away. The cognitive gears in his exhausted mind turned grinding against the weight of his past actions. The medication flowing through his veins could not dull the profound, piercing clarity of this specific moment. He remembered the $50,000 contract. He remembered the dark, humid driveway. He remembered looking into my eyes and declaring I was nothing to his family. Then he looked at the portable heart monitor resting beside his arm. He looked at the sterile bandages covering his chest. The truth assembled itself with ruthless mathematical precision. The robotic machinery that bypassed his failing arteries, the concierge suite, where he recovered the very breath filling his lungs, every single component of his survival was purchased and owned by the daughter he discarded. He was alive solely through the silent, unearned mercy of the girl he sacrificed to protect a parasitic son. The irony possessed a physical weight. It crushed the remaining breath from his lungs. Richard did not puff out his chest. He did not attempt to smile for the press or project an image of country club dignity. The sheer magnitude of his regret shattered his stoic facade. He raised his weak, trembling hands and pressed his palms against his face. He wept. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was a deep, ragged weeping that shook his fragile shoulders and rattled the plastic tubing delivering his oxygen. The sound was a raw, unfiltered broadcast of a man realizing his entire life was a monument to the wrong child. He had gambled his estate, his legacy, and his family on a golden boy who produced nothing but debt. He had exiled the only child capable of building an empire. Now he was forced to heal inside a multi-million-dollar facility bearing her name, a permanent geographical reminder of his catastrophic miscalculation. Brenda heard her husband sobbing. She finally opened her eyes, looking at the man she had helped ruin. She placed a hand over her mouth, her own tears spilling over her eyelashes. Bryce turned away, unable to witness the physical collapse of the patriarch he had bankrupted. Jessica simply stared at the floor, trapped in a nightmare she could not escape. The applause in the atrium continued, unaware of the private tragedy unfolding in the front row. The board members smiled and shook hands, celebrating a new era of medical advancement. I stood perfectly still, watching the tears slip between my father's trembling fingers. I felt no urge to comfort him. I felt no desire to offer absolution or assure him that the past was forgiven. Forgiveness is a gift granted to those who seek to repair the damage they caused. My family never sought repair. They only sought a limitless line of credit. The ledger was finally closed. The invoice was settled, and the receipt was permanently etched into the structural foundation of the hospital. The public execution they attempted to orchestrate a decade ago had been reversed, arriving today as a masterpiece of poetic justice. But the ceremony was concluding, and the time had come to draw the final ironclad boundary around my life. I needed to issue the closing directives that would protect my peace and leave them to navigate the ruins of their own making. The applause in the grand atrium eventually receded, giving way to the soft murmur of departing executives and shifting camera equipment. The string quartet packed their instruments into velvet-lined cases. The heavy theatrical lighting dimmed, returning the hospital wing to a standard clinical brightness. As the crowd thinned out, my family remained anchored to the polished terrazzo floor near the front row of seating. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck, stranded on a hostile shore. Brenda took a hesitant step toward me. The country club armor she wore for decades was entirely stripped away, leaving a frail, terrified woman in its place. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her lips trembled as she prepared to speak. I knew the exact sequence of words she was frantically assembling in her mind. She intended to beg for forgiveness. She planned to weave a new narrative, claiming she always knew I would achieve greatness and hoping we could heal the ruptured bonds of our bloodline. I raised my right hand, halting her advance before a single syllable could escape her throat. I did not stick around to entertain her apologies. An apology delivered in the shadow of a gilded marble wall is not a genuine expression of remorse. It is a desperate business proposal, drafted by an individual who just discovered the actual net worth of her target. I do not negotiate with toxic assets, and I do not accept counterfeit contrition. I turned my attention to the senior nursing director who had supervised my father's emergency intake. I instructed her to forward all incidental invoices, out-of-pocket deductibles, and premium room charges directly to my philanthropic foundation. I established an ironclad boundary in that moment. I refused to let my parents die drowning in medical debt. I authorized the payments not out of a buried sense of familial love, but out of a strict adherence to my own ethical ledger. A precise woman pays the balances she dictates. I brought them to the concierge wing, and I would cover the cost of that transition. They would return to New Hampshire with a zero balance on their healthcare accounts. However, my philanthropy extended only to the preservation of life. It did not cover the preservation of their suburban illusions. I pivoted toward the high-top table, where Bryce was leaning against the pristine white linen. He looked hollowed out, stripped of the unearned arrogance that had defined his entire adult existence. I walked over to him, stopping just outside his personal space. I kept my voice low and devoid of any lingering familial attachment. I outlined the timeline of his impending reality. The debt collection subsidiary I controlled had already processed the defaulted secondary mortgage on the Bedford estate. The deed transfer was a matter of public record. I informed my brother he had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. The days of treating our parents' home as a personal, subsidized hotel were officially over. The 38-year-old golden boy was going to face the unforgiving landscape of the American workforce. He would need to secure employment, earn a legitimate paycheck, and rent an apartment he could actually afford. Jessica stood a few feet away, listening to the eviction notice. The tears drying on her cheeks gave way to a cold, calculating panic. She looked at her husband with undisguised contempt. The affluent lifestyle she chased was dead. She was tethered to a man who possessed no wealth, no influence, and no home. The gears in her mind were already turning, plotting her exit strategy from a bankrupt marriage. I did not wait for Bryce to formulate a response. I delivered the terms of their surrender and turned my back on the wreckage. I walked out of the grand atrium, crossing the vast lobby, toward the sliding glass exit doors. The hospital staff parted, offering respectful nods as I passed. I stepped out into the warm Massachusetts evening. The humid air smelled of cooling asphalt and distant rain. I navigated the concrete pathways of the subterranean parking garage until I reached my vehicle. I slid into the driver's seat, closing the heavy door. The solid thud sealed out the noise of the medical center. I pressed the ignition button. The engine purred to life, wrapping me in a subtle, muscular vibration. The passenger seat next to me was empty. The plain manila folder that had accompanied me for a decade was gone, having served its ultimate purpose. I navigated the spiraling ramps of the garage and merged onto the interstate, heading north toward the heart of Boston. I kept the radio powered off. The quiet hum of the tires against the pavement was a symphony of untethered freedom. I felt no lingering guilt. I felt no residual anger. The invisible weight I had carried since that humid night in the driveway was permanently lifted. I was unbothered. The social fallout in New Hampshire unfolded over the following week, operating with the swift, brutal efficiency unique to affluent suburbs. The Public Relations Department at St. Jude's Regional Medical Center issued a formal press release detailing the dedication of the new cardiac wing. The local Bedford newspaper picked up the wire story, printing a high-resolution photograph of the marble wall on the front page. The gossip networks within the country club ignited. The tennis partners and charity board members read the article detailing the philanthropic empire built by the discarded Robinson daughter. The same neighbors who had delivered casseroles and offered misplaced sympathy a decade earlier now experienced a profound collective realization. Brenda's old social media posts aged with agonizing cruelty. The tearful manifestos where she labeled me a selfish failure were juxtaposed against the reality of my multi-million-dollar healthcare endowment. The community connected the dots. They understood that Brenda and Richard had sacrificed a brilliant, capable daughter to coddle a fraudulent son. The resulting social exile was instantaneous. My mother could no longer show her face at the weekly luncheons. The whispers followed her down every aisle of the local grocery market. She was deposed from her suburban throne by the irrefutable evidence of her own profound miscalculation. Bryce failed to secure an executive position. The corporate world lacks patience for men with fabricated resumes and non-existent references. He was forced to accept a mid-level sales role at a regional logistics firm far outside the prestigious boundaries of his former life. His luxury vehicle was repossessed. The illusion was buried. This is the anatomy of a reconciled ledger. True revenge does not require shouting at the people who hurt you. It does not demand a public spectacle of tears or a desperate plea for them to recognize your worth. True revenge is a quiet, methodical discipline. It is letting your enemies run their mouths, spinning their elaborate fictions, while you go to work in the dark. It is the patience to build a marble wall bearing your name and allowing the sheer gravity of your success to crush their delusions. Keep your receipts. Protect your peace. Let the golden children exhaust their credit limits while you build an empire they can never touch. Thank you for spending your evening with me. If you are the family scapegoat currently building your future in silence, remember that the truth never expires. Share this story with someone who needs the strength to walk away from a one-sided table. Drop a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Hit the subscribe button to join Pan of Vengeance, and I will see you in the next one.